There's been mixed reaction over President Cyril Ramaphosa's assertion that the state does not create jobs but only makes the conditions conducive for the private sector to create employment. The South African Communist Party is among those who are criticizing the president for his statement, calling on him to re-examine his assertion on the matter. We're joined by Dr Alex Mashilo, who is the SACP spokesperson. Dr Mashilo, thank you very much for joining us. So you believe or you have characterized the president's assertion as neoliberal and fatally flawed. Why?
Because in the first instance, it originates from classical liberalism. It was elevated in the 19th century liberalism. In the 1970s, when the capitalist world economy experienced a crisis, that stance from the 19th century liberalism was refined by neoliberalism, when it was pushing that the state should have no role in the economy must be left to the private sector companies that engage in private accumulation of wealth for their owners. Secondly, that assertion is not consistent with the realities of South Africa. You and I know that the state has historically played a key role in creating employment in South Africa. It was the state that created the company today you know by ArcelorMittal. That was ISCO. It was one of the largest steel manufacturers in the country before it was privatized. It was also the South African state that created Spoornet, from which we saw the likes of Transnet emerge. PRASA emerged from that. Those companies have created employment and are employing workers. It was the South African state that created the South African Airways, the South African SA Express, the Airports Company of South Africa, or the Airports Company South Africa. It is the South African state that created the South African Broadcasting Corporation. I'm sure you know that if we were to take Newzroom Afrika as a private company and compare it with the South African Broadcasting Corporation, the SABC, it will be wrong in the extreme to suggest that because Newzroom Afrika is a private company, it is the one that created the employment of yourselves and other colleagues working for it, but that the state did not create the employment of the many workers employed by the SABC. In South Africa, as we speak, there are national, provincial, and municipal state-owned enterprises, all of which have created employment. The entire employment, if you adopt a value chain analysis, the entire employment in the supply chain of state-owned enterprises is state-created employment. Because if the state was to terminate those contracts and tenders, that employment will disappear. Many lawyers in our economy and accounting firms, even multinational firms, are employed by the state. Take, for example, the KPMG, which was named in the state capture scenario. The work that it was doing in the state. That was state-created employment. And all workers who performed that work were performing it in state-created employment. There are many other examples we can give. In fact, if you look at the economy of South Africa, the state is a major employer. The South African economy is characterized by uneven development. There are provinces and regions without industry at all. The state in those areas is an employer of note. According to the South African statistics, there are about between 14 to 16 million employed South Africans. If you can subtract the number of state-owned, state-employed workers from that number will come significantly down. So if you look at the South African Statistics Employment Survey, which takes into account everybody employed in the economy, and subtract or minus, if we were to use that synonym, state-employed workers and workers employed in state contracts and state tenders, and in the supply chain of state public institutions, the public protector, the courts of law and everything, that employment will come significantly down. So it is fatally flawed to suggest that the state does not create employment. The state creates employment through its direct participation in the economy, one. Two, the state creates employment through policy, two. Okay? So that's the reality we are in this country. If in fact you
Dr.
look at the
Mashilo,
state
just
of the nation,
to pick up on a thought, please allow me to join the conversation. Just to pick up on that thought that says, you know, the state created jobs even with the previous dispensation, but those jobs were not enjoyed by the majority of people in this country. So let's take a look at present-day South Africa in 2022. You come back to say that the state actually employs, you know, in the majority, they employ people in their majority. According to you, you know, as a tripartite alliance partner, in which ways can we stimulate not only the economy, but create jobs that are desperately needed by the young people of this country? A short while ago, we were speaking to a labor lawyer who was pointing out that in this case of government taking one of private firms, you know, to the courts because of the Employment Equity Act, we don't even have quotas in terms of how many foreign nationals should be hired, or how many South Africans should be hired, how many women should be hired, how many men should be hired, for instance.
Yeah, let me just make one correction. We are not saying the state is employing workers in the majority. We are saying the state is employing a significant people who count as employed in the economy of South Africa. And we are not denying the fact that the private sector does create employment. What we are saying is that the fact that the private sector does create employment does not mean that the state does not create employment. It's wrong. It's a neoliberal assertion that aims at uprooting this, and it doesn't come from the president. It comes from the history of the development of liberalism and neoliberalism, in terms of which you saw historically massive privatization and outsourcing of state productive resources of state functions. And people employed in those functions would later be referred to as employed in the private sector, which they are not employed in the private sector, but in the public sector extended through those contracts. Okay? And before we even proceed, in the private sector, like yourself, in your case, you can only be employed where you are employed now. Insofar as your labor increases capital for accumulation by your employers, all right? If that doesn't happen, your employment will not take place. If you want the evidence of this, you must look at what happened in the second quarter of 2021 in our economy. When profiteering or when profits came under pressure, 2.2 million workers were retrenched in the economy, because the primary purpose for which private companies are established is not that of employment, it's that of profit-making. Employment becomes a mechanism to make profit. So that is clear. So the primary function of the state, therefore, is to create employment. And this is in line. If you go to the manifesto of the ANC that was endorsed by the Alliance in 2019, we make it very clear that it is the role of the state to both create employment and to facilitate conditions for employment creation in the economy. In fact, as the SACP, we are quite disappointed that the state has not done enough to build a large and thriving cooperative sector. That is a sector where people who work in companies are the ones who own those companies. It is a sector of collective ownership. The state has not performed well in promoting, diversifying, and growing that sector. And we believe that if the state was to do that, it will answer your question on what we should do in order to create employment in the economy. Because the cooperative sector does not involve exploitation. It involves establishing companies that are collectively owned by the workers who work inside those companies.